Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into a world where stone walls weep with cold, where your breath hangs in the air even indoors, and where comfort isn't found in modern heating or insulation, but in thread, wool, and the odd miracle of tapestry. You've wandered through rain-slicked fields and muddy footpaths, and now you find yourself ducking into the low door frame of a peasant stone cottage. The wind howls behind you, slipping through every crack and crevice like an uninvited spirit. Inside it's hardly warmer, but on the far wall something catches your eye. A heavy sheet of embroidered cloth. Not for art, not for beauty, but simply to survive. You reach out, running your fingers along the worn surface. It's thick, scratchy, and smells faintly of smoke and damp wool. The wall behind it feels colder than a cellar slab. That tapestry isn't just decoration, it's armour, fabric armour, against a world that doesn't much care if your fingers freeze off. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. Let's see who's up late with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle farther inside the cottage, shoulders still stiff from the chill outside. There's no fireplace, just a small pit of coals and a pot of water barely steaming. The walls, though, every one of them, are partially covered in woven fabric. Some are plain, others bear crude images, stitched in dull reds and browns, a dog chasing a hare, a tree with oddly geometric branches, maybe even a chicken wearing what looks suspiciously like a crown. They're strange and lumpy, uneven at the corners, tacked up with iron nails or sewn right into the wooden beams. And yet they give the room a softness the stone can't. They absorb the echo, deaden the draft, and even catch some of the smoky dampness rising from the floor. A medieval insulation system, biodegradable and semi-decorative. Not bad for the 1300s. Outside, the wind keens through the thatch like a pack of wolves. You remember your own house with its thermostat and double-glazed windows, and you feel a sudden, deep sympathy for the people who once sat here. Because even with 4 layers of linen, a wool tunic, and a hood pulled low, you're still cold. And someone long ago figured out that draping heavy fabric over walls could at least keep the worst of the winter out, or keep the best of the heat in. And yes, medieval peasants probably didn't have a clue about our values or thermal conduction. But they knew through experience and numb fingers that bare stone was a cruel companion in winter. Tapestries weren't just extra, they were survival tools, and sometimes the only thing standing between a family and pneumonia. The earliest known examples of wall hangings in peasant homes weren't the rich, glorious works of silk and gold thread you'd find in a noble hall. No, they were coarse wool, dyed with local plants, stitched with rough, uneven hands during the few quiet hours before bed. Some were patchwork, sewn together from worn-out clothing and leftover scraps. Others used old blankets or grain sacks turned inside out. A particularly luxurious version might involve felted wool from sheep that hadn't been properly washed, which, yes, smelled like a barnyard in summer. But they worked. You imagine a family of 6 huddled together at night, the youngest wrapped in a scrap of tapestry, the mother checking that the cloth was still nailed firm to the north-facing wall. This wasn't Martha Stewart home decor. This was a medieval version of duct taping a garbage bag over a broken window and hoping for the best. You trace one embroidered line with your finger, noticing how uneven the stitches are and how tightly pulled the thread feels. It's not elegant, but it's intentional. Someone cared enough to stitch a vine up the side, add a few little leaves, and even, just maybe, a crooked heart near the top. Whether it was boredom, pride, or an attempt at beauty, it became part of the tapestry's life. Some of the fabric was dyed using roots, berries, and, yes, urine. Pee. It turns out you need ammonia to fix the colours, and there's plenty of that in a chamber pot. So next time you feel proud of your DIY throw pillow, just remember, they had to ferment bodily fluids to make that faded burgundy dye. But hey, it lasted through 100 winters, so maybe don't knock it. The thing is, when you live in a world without central heating, without insulation, and with a window that's just a hole in the wall covered by an oiled animal bladder, you get creative. And while most history books focus on kings, battles, and revolutions, it's small acts of domestic survival like these, hanging cloth to block wind, that kept entire generations alive. Some historians believe that the tradition of wall hangings came not from castles but from necessity, the evolution of blanket as barrier. Others argue it began as a noble trend, slowly trickling down through imitation and leftover cast-offs. Old discarded noble tapestries were sometimes cut up and sold or repurposed by peasants. You might get the top half of a knight's face in your wall covering, or a goat leg where a saint's foot used to be. But most agree, by the 14th century, it wasn't uncommon to find woolen hangings even in the humblest of homes. Though no one's entirely sure who started it, or when exactly it became widespread. As usual, and you'll hear me say this a lot, historians still argue about the details. What's not in dispute is that these makeshift tapestries were more than warmth. They were memory, identity, and maybe even pride. Families would add to them, stitch by stitch, year after year, like a medieval Pinterest board, but with fewer cats and way more practical value. You sit for a moment wrapped in the dim flicker of tallow candlelight. The wind howls, the coals crackle faintly, and across from you the tapestry shudders just slightly in a draught. It's not perfect, but it's home. And in this cold, forgotten corner of the world, it might be the only thing standing between you and a long, frosty night. The morning creeps in slowly through a gap in the shutters. Not that you can call it morning with much confidence. It's more of a dim grey smear that suggests the sun is out there somewhere, hiding behind a blanket of fog and damp. You stretch stiffly beneath the coarse wool blanket someone lent you, the one that smells faintly of mildew and sheep. The tapestry on the far wall is still there, sagging a little at the edges, but holding firm against the cold draught seeping through the stone. You step outside into the village lane, where the mud squelches under your boots. The air tastes of smoke, wet hay and manure, which is about right for a place where sanitation means keep the pigs out of the bed. You pass one cottage after another, each one built of stone or wattle and daub, roofs of thatch bending under the weight of a damp morning. And nearly every one of them, you notice now, has a tapestry or fabric scrap hanging somewhere inside, visible through an open door or a cracked shutter. They're not all works of art. In fact, most are more enthusiastic attempt than gallery-worthy masterpiece. But they serve their purpose. And in their quiet way, they connect every family in the village, a shared understanding of cold, of frugality, and of making do. The thing is, tapestries weren't just for warmth. In a time when walls were made of stone and floors were made of dirt, people longed for softness. A bit of cloth on the wall gave a sense of comfort, a suggestion that the house was more than a cave, that it could be home. But of course, not everyone had the skill or time to make these things from scratch. That's where the quiet heroes of this little village stepped in. The women and men who turned thread and cloth into something protective, even beautiful. Most villages had at least one weaver or spinner, often older, usually a little grumpy, and always covered in lint. These were the people who knew how to make a sheep's backside into something worth hanging on a wall. You wander toward the edge of town, where the smoke thins out and the noise fades to a few clucking hens. There, in a squat timber shed with smoke curling from the thatch, you find her, the village weaver. She doesn't look up when you enter, just keeps feeding yarn onto a large wooden loom that creaks like an old ship. The rhythm is hypnotic. Forward, pull, clack. Forward, pull, clack. The yarn moves like a soft river, slowly forming a pattern only she can see. Her hands work without hesitation, as though they're simply remembering something her brain doesn't need to think about anymore. You ask a question, something about how she started weaving, and she grunts, then she shrugs. My mum did, she says, not looking up. And her mum, same reason you breathe. It's just what we do. You notice scraps of dyed wool lying around, rusty reds, smoky blues, a dull green that's probably made from boiled nettles. Dyes weren't easy to come by. The blue might have come from woad, a plant that smells like fermented feet when prepared. The red? Maybe madder root, crushed and soaked in clay pots for days. And of course, yellow often came from, wait for it, stale urine. Yes, again. You're starting to realize that peasant life was just a long game of how badly do you want this colour? Still, the weaver hums softly as she works, content. You spot a partly finished tapestry rolled up in the corner. It shows a deer standing under a stylized tree. It's uneven, a little abstract, like if Picasso had learned embroidery before painting. But it's full of warmth, full of intention. There's something sacred about this place. Not in the religious sense, though the crucifix above the doorway suggests she says her prayers. No. Sacred in the way small acts become meaningful when repeated across generations. When you can't write your name, but you can weave your daughter's birth into the edge of a tapestry, you're doing more than crafting. You're remembering. Some say this is how oral history became visual history. Not everyone could read or write, but they could stitch. And what you couldn't say out loud, especially if it involved politics, grief, or a little superstition, you could hint at with thread. Look closely at older tapestries and you'll find strange little details. A cat with two tails, a man with no mouth, a child holding what looks like a key in one hand and a dead bird in the other. Some were warnings, others were stories passed down in secret. A few were just doodles that got out of hand. Historians still debate the meaning of certain symbols. Was the spiral a sign of rebirth, or just a bored weaver with too much yellow thread? Was the upside-down crown in the corner an act of rebellion, or just a mistake stitched upside down during a thunderstorm? There's one old tale that villagers hear whisper, that a weaver once encoded a family feud into a tapestry, hiding insults in the pattern. The wrong shape of leaf meant, "You stole my goat." A crooked fence line said, "Your father's a liar." By the time the recipient figured it out, the weaver had already moved to the next village, leaving nothing but thread and petty revenge hanging on the wall. You smile at the thought. The past wasn't always noble or solemn. Sometimes it was just people being people, cold, bored, and looking for a way to keep both their bodies and their minds occupied. As the weaver stands and stretches her back, you thank her and step outside once more. The day hasn't warmed, not really, but somehow everything feels a little less harsh now that you know how much care went into those scraps of cloth. Back in the village, you pass a boy hanging a new tapestry in his family's cottage. It's small and clumsy, but his face beams with pride. You wonder what future historians might say about that one. And as the fog rolls in again, soft and slow, you tuck your hands into your sleeves and think. Maybe survival wasn't just about food or fire. Maybe it was also about finding ways, quiet, creative, enduring ways, to feel human. The afternoon light fades early in this part of the countryside, not because the sun sets especially fast, but because the clouds never seem to leave. You find yourself drawn toward one of the more curious cottages in the village, one whose exterior wall is nearly covered by a patchwork of woven cloths. Some are sun-bleached and ragged. Others are newer, stiff with dye, their edges fluttering slightly in the breeze. It looks less like a home and more like a giant quilt hung out to dry, or perhaps like someone forgot where the wall ended and the tapestry began. Inside you discover that the tradition of tapestry isn't always utilitarian. Sometimes it's storytelling, an illustrated diary in wool and thread. You're ushered in by a stooped old man who introduces himself as Oswin. His beard is wispy, but his fingers are strong and precise, covered in calluses and faint stains from decades of dye work. He leads you into a room lined floor to ceiling with wall hangings, each one a chapter in his family's history. "See that one?" he says, pointing to a faded tapestry with a crooked ox and an oddly proportioned farmer. "That's my great-grandfather, losing the plough in a rainstorm. He never let go of the reins, though. That's what the thread there's about. Stubbornness, or foolishness, depending on who's telling it." You squint at the embroidery. The colours are muddled, the wool is pilled, and the perspective is completely wrong. Yet somehow it's far more alive than any oil painting. You can feel the rain in the loops of thread, the wind in the lines of the ox's tail. It's all there, just told in a different language. Oswin goes on, tapping another piece that shows a field full of tiny white dots. "Locusts," he mutters. "We threshed with blankets and prayers that year. The only green left was the envy we had for the next village over." You can't help but chuckle. Tapestries like these weren't just insulation. They were memory keepers. And in a time when parchment was expensive and most people couldn't write, a stitched field or a misshapen sheep could mean the difference between forgetting and remembering. But these stories weren't always personal. Many wall hangings shared common tales. Stories passed from village to village, embroidered like whispers on wool. One of the most popular was the legend of the 3 travellers who traded their shadows for safe passage through the mountains. The tale changed with every telling. Sometimes they were monks, sometimes thieves, and sometimes one was a talking goat with a flair for dramatic exits. In one version, still hanging behind Oswin's stove, you see the outlines of 3 hooded figures walking into a crooked forest. One of them is missing feet entirely, another has a shadow going in the wrong direction. You ask what it means and Oswin shrugs. No one agrees. Some say it's about sacrifice. Others say it's a warning not to travel with goats. Historians have pored over tapestries like these, trying to pin down origins or decode their symbolism. But the truth is, a lot of it was probably just made up on the spot, or misremembered, or wildly embroidered by someone who'd had one too many cups of barley beer. And still, it lasted, passed down through loops and knots and stubborn wool fibres. The story survived, even when the names didn't. You lean closer to a smaller piece, stitched in darker tones. A woman stands in profile, holding a candle. Behind her in rough red thread is the faint outline of a wolf. Oswin notices your interest. "That one's about Maren the candle reader," he says. "She was half healer, half troublemaker. People said she could see death in the way wax melted. Not always popular during winter, that." You imagine a cold night, a flickering candle, and the quiet dread of watching the wax pool wrong. It's not hard to see how myths formed here, and how those myths were sewn into cloth rather than carved in stone. There's a kind of reverence in how these stories live on, not shouted but murmured, not engraved but woven. And when one tapestry frayed or faded beyond repair, it didn't disappear. It was often stitched into a new one, recycled, repurposed, hidden behind newer scenes like a ghost in the wall. Some of Oswin's older tapestries have extra thickness in certain corners, layers of memory. You ask him if he ever signs his work. He laughs. A soft, wheezing sound. What for? The stories aren't mine. I'm just passing them on. Better to let the thread do the talking. There's something humbling about that. In modern times, every post needs a name, a like, a little blue check mark. But here in this modest cottage, stories exist for their own sake. No credit, no ego, just wool and time. As you thank Oswin and step back outside, you realise the world looks a little different now. Every cottage with a wall hanging, even a ragged one, might be hiding a saga, a joke, a memory, maybe even a warning. And as the wind picks up again, tugging at the edge of your hood, you find yourself wishing you could stitch today into fabric, the way the light softens on stone, the sound of distant chickens, the smell of damp wool and cooked barley. You can't, of course, but someone somewhere probably already has. You follow the worn path that winds past the village green, where goats nibble absent-mindedly on patches of stubborn winter grass. Your feet crunch over frost-laced earth, and your breath rises in slow curls as you head toward the fields. The sun hangs low, casting a pale amber light that filters through the leafless trees. And just ahead, in a small cottage nestled at the forest's edge, you're told lives a woman named Anwen, one of the few in the region who weaves stories straight into her tapestries, line by line, like a medieval novel without pages. Her cottage is crooked, clearly rebuilt more than once, and the smoke from the chimney drifts sideways in the wind like it's unsure of its destination. You knock softly and she answers in silence, ushering you in with a hand gesture and a knowing smile. The air inside is warm and earthy, filled with the smell of peat smoke and dried herbs. And everywhere, from rafters to floorboards, there are tapestries, rolled, draped, folded, or pinned to beams. Every wall, every surface tells a different story. Anwen works by the window, hunched over a frame stretched taut with rough linen. She doesn't stop weaving when you enter. Her hands move with quiet certainty, threading colours into the fabric, in a rhythm so natural it seems like she's not weaving at all, just uncovering something that was always there. She finally speaks, her voice soft and textured like worn velvet. "This one's a warning," she says, nodding toward the piece she's working on. You look closely. A pale man in a dark cloak is walking into a river. Behind him, eyes peek out from a tangled thicket. It's haunting, abstract, yet somehow more expressive than any painting. No one remembers his name, she adds, but the river still remembers. You ask what happened, but she doesn't answer, just smiles, as if the answer is stitched somewhere in the tapestry, waiting to be found. Tapestries like these were more than warm wall hangings. They were messages, quiet, sometimes coded. A language of thread passed between hands when words weren't safe. In some regions, peasants were discouraged from openly criticising landlords or clergy. But a strange stitched bird pecking a lion's tail, that could mean anything, or everything. You recall one story, half legend, half historical rumour, about a woman who embroidered a bishop's nose onto a pig's body and hung it in her kitchen. When questioned, she claimed it was just a farm scene. Of course, everyone knew exactly what she meant. Apparently, the bishop never visited her village again. Historians today argue over the meanings of these folk tapestries. Some say the images were mostly symbolic, with deeper meanings passed orally. Others believe they were purely decorative, and any deeper interpretation is modern imagination at work. As always, the truth probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. Anwen leads you to a wall where several older pieces hang in layers. She peels one back, revealing a worn tapestry nearly black with age. It's hard to make out the images. The colours have faded, the threads loosened. But you spot shapes. Figures dancing under a moon, a tree with severed limbs, a fish with a crown. No one remembers what this one meant, she murmurs, but they kept it anyway. That's something you've noticed more and more, the idea that meaning isn't always necessary. In this world of relentless survival, of hunger and frostbite, and plagues and taxes, people still made things just in case. Just in case someone remembered. Just in case it mattered. Just in case a cold night became a little warmer when a story, however vague, was close at hand. And then she shows you her favourite piece, a small square tapestry that barely fits on the back of a chair. Simple, 2 hands, stitched in cream thread against a grey background. No faces, no setting, just the suggestion of a moment. It's a goodbye, she says, or maybe a hello, I've never decided. That seems to sum it up, doesn't it? The ambiguity, the softness, the feeling of stories stitched by people who didn't need them to be perfect, only to be felt. She invites you to sit while she finishes her thread. You settle into a chair near the hearth, where a kettle hums quietly and a cat sleeps on a folded tapestry like a furry punctuation mark. The room glows golden with firelight and dust. And for a while you don't speak. You just watch the slow motion of her hands as the story continues, one stitch at a time. And even though you can't read this story like a book, you understand it, because you felt what it means to hold on to something small and fragile, to wrap yourself in it on a cold night, hoping it'll keep the world at bay. Eventually she rolls up the frame and places it gently in a basket. You'll see more of this sort, she says. Stories that don't end. They just hang on the wall and wait for someone to remember how they began. Outside the wind has picked up. You pull your cloak tighter and look back once more at the cottage, the windows glowing like lanterns in the dusk. And as you walk away, you think, this isn't just about keeping warm. It's about stitching meaning into a world that often offers none. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You wake the next morning to the faint sound of church bells echoing across the fields, muffled by fog and distance. The air is cold enough to bite, and your breath still clouds in front of you, but you pull on your cloak and boots, ready for another day among the quiet rhythms of medieval life. Today your steps take you away from the cottages and into the broader countryside, where a manor house looms in the distance. A stark silhouette of stone, chimneys and grey tiles against the washed-out sky. Unlike the peasants' homes you've seen, this place belongs to someone with wealth. Not a king, not even a duke, just a middling noble with a bit of land and a title long enough to impress dinner guests. Still, even in this house of means, the walls are draped in tapestries. The difference? These are elaborate, expensive, and clearly meant to impress. As you step into the entry hall, your eyes are drawn immediately to a massive tapestry stretching across the far wall. It's rich with colour, deep indigo, crimson, gold that glimmers faintly in the light from tall, narrow windows. The scene shows a knight in armour, standing beneath a tree, offering a flower to a lady who looks like she's deciding whether to be flattered or bored. The detail is extraordinary. You can see the pattern on her sleeves, the tiny laces on the knight's boots, even the startled expression on a squirrel in the corner. But behind all that elegance lies something familiar. The tapestry covers the same stone walls. The same bitter drafts creep around the edges of the floor. The difference here isn't warmth, it's display. Here, tapestries serve not just as insulation, but as a declaration. We're rich, cultured, and yes, we own the squirrel that got woven into the background. Your guide through the manor, a steward with a voice like dried parchment, tells you the tapestry came from Flanders. Imported, costly, and so precious that guests weren't allowed to touch it. Not even the children, he adds, glancing sternly at you as though you might be tempted to sneak a feel. You follow him down a hallway where nearly every wall is covered in scenes of hunting, courtship, and religious devotion. The Virgin Mary appears frequently, as do suspiciously handsome angels who look more like courtly knights than messengers of God. One tapestry shows a scene from the Bible, though the sheep are wearing tiny decorative bells, and one of the apostles appears to be juggling. You ask if anyone in the house can actually read the Latin stitched across the borders. The steward clears his throat. Well, no, not fluently, he admits, but the bishop said it adds refinement. You nod solemnly. Nothing says class like words no one understands in a language no one speaks. Still, it's hard not to be impressed. The sheer scale, the craftsmanship, the way these tapestries manage to do everything at once, insulate, decorate, impress, narrate, even intimidate. Some nobles commissioned custom works that told the story of their family lineage, stretching the truth just a little, of course. That heroic victory over a rival might have been a minor skirmish involving 4 tired horses and a goat, but once it's stitched in gold thread, instant legend. Historians believe that noble tapestries like these often took months, even years, to complete. And they weren't made in the manor itself. They were ordered from specialist workshops in cities like Arras or Bruges, where master weavers led teams of apprentices and journeymen. Each person worked on a section, following a full-scale drawing called a cartoon, though there was nothing funny about it, unless you count the angel juggling. You ask your guide how many of the household tapestries were made locally. None, he says, looking mildly horrified. Our tapestries are continental. You resist the urge to ask whether the drafts coming through the walls are also imported. But here's where it gets interesting. While these noble tapestries were ostentatious, they also served a remarkably practical function. Without them, large halls echoed like empty caves, fires couldn't heat high-ceilinged rooms, and windows were more decorative than functional. Hanging cloth helped mute the sound, absorb the chill, and soften the stark austerity of stone. And as with the peasant homes, these tapestries became layered with time. A noble family might hang a new scene over an old one, or shift a tapestry from the great hall to a private chamber when the colours faded or the themes fell out of fashion. The Crusades are so last century. In some rare cases, hidden images were discovered on the backs of tapestries, often unfinished works, or even full designs that had been stitched over. One such piece, uncovered during restoration in the 19th century, showed a hunting scene with a single monk off to the side holding a scroll that read, "I told you this was a bad idea." Perhaps medieval humour was subtler than we think. You pause before one tapestry that shows a feast. Long tables, roast birds, servants bustling to and fro. But tucked in the background, almost hidden near a doorway, is a figure crouching with a basket. You ask the steward who that is. He frowns, looks and shrugs. Probably the kitchen boy, or someone's idea of a joke. That's the strange magic of tapestries. They freeze a moment in time, but they also leave space for mystery. Who added that figure? Was it part of the original design, or something slipped in by a mischievous apprentice? We may never know. And that's what keeps historians up at night, trying to decode meanings sewn by hands that never imagined their work would survive this long. As you leave the manor and step back into the raw light of afternoon, your eyes feel dazzled by colour, your head full of images. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone wanted warmth. Everyone wanted beauty. And everyone wanted their story, even in the smallest way, to be told. You tighten your cloak and begin walking back toward the village, the wind chasing dried leaves around your feet. And in your mind, those noble tapestries blur into the humbler ones. Threads of different colours, but woven for the same reason: to make the world a little less cold. The wind picks up again as you descend the muddy hill back into the village. You pull your cloak tighter, though by now you've gotten used to the cold gnawing at your ears and fingertips. Your boots are damp, your nose tingles, but there's something oddly comforting about it all. Like the land is whispering, "You're not special, everyone freezes here." This time your path leads to the market square, not that it's bustling. A few bundled figures shuffle between stalls, trading root vegetables, firewood, and the occasional flitch of bacon. But you're not here for meat, you're here for fabric. And that brings you to one of the most underrated figures in village life, the cloth merchant. The stall isn't glamorous. It's a wooden frame, draped with sacks and mismatched linen scraps, topped by a sloped cloth roof that's doing a very bad job of staying dry. But hanging from the central beam, carefully protected in waxed wrapping, are bolts of wool, linen, and even, gasp, a scrap of fine imported silk. The merchant eyes you suspiciously. You're not dressed like a local. Still, he nods in greeting and gestures to the wares. "Good thread this year," he says. "Moths kept out for once." You run your fingers along a coarse strip of wool dyed a dusty green. It's itchy, smells faintly of hay. Perfect. Next to it is a length of undyed linen, rough, uneven, flecked with bits of stalk and chaff. "Homegrown," the merchant mutters proudly. "Spun by my wife, beat by my son, and cursed at by me." Strikes you just how much effort it takes to make fabric here. There are no machines, no fast fashion. Every inch of cloth represents hours, days, of work. Shearing the sheep, washing the wool, carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving. And that's just before someone gets around to sewing it into a robe, a curtain, or, yes, a tapestry. In fact, buying fabric at the market is kind of like buying future insulation. Most of what's sold here isn't meant for clothes. It's for wall hangings, bed coverings, or layering over window holes. In a home with one room, one fire, and 6 people, you use whatever you can to keep the heat from vanishing. A woman nearby haggles fiercely over a faded length of the red wool. "It's for my daughter's wall," she snaps. "She coughs all night." The merchant nods grimly. 2 pennies and a turnip, he offers. Historians often forget these little transactions. They focus on kings, crusades, treaties, but they rarely pause to imagine the middle-aged mother trading root vegetables for warmth, or the child behind that wall, curled beneath a threadbare sheet, praying the wind doesn't find its way in again. You linger as a young boy arrives, proudly holding a hand-dyed strip of cloth. It's bright yellow, shockingly yellow, and he insists it's worth 3 eggs. "I boiled onion skins for hours," he says, "and the goat only drank half the dye pot." The merchant laughs and gives him half a loaf of bread in exchange. That's the other thing about colour. It wasn't just pretty, it was power. A splash of blue meant someone found woad, fermented it, and didn't gag from the smell. Green meant nettles or copper shavings. Red came from madder roots or crushed insects, if you were lucky enough to afford them. Purple, forget it. Unless you knew a bishop personally, purple was for dreams. Even the dyes told stories. You could trace a family's luck by the fading tones of their wall hangings. A tapestry that started out bright might dull over the years, fading alongside fortunes. Or a patch of sudden colour might hint at an unexpected wedding gift, a good harvest, or a generous neighbour. And of course, nothing lasted forever. Moths, moisture, smoke, children with dirty fingers. The enemy of every tapestry was time, and time, as you're learning, is particularly cruel to wool. Still, people mended. They stitched patches into worn places. They dyed over stains. And when the cloth became too fragile to hang, they'd lay it flat and use it as a bed mat or a burial shroud. Because nothing was wasted. You buy a strip of plain brown wool just for the experience. The merchant wraps it in paper that smells like onions and hands it to you like a sacred relic. Good for the feet, he says, or the dog, or the wind. As you tuck it into your bag and walk on, you pass a stall selling second-hand goods. There, between a cracked pot and a rusty knife, hangs a small, tattered tapestry. The stitches are uneven, the image unclear, but it shows a figure in a long cloak, holding something, maybe a flower, maybe a torch, while behind them, jagged lines suggest wind or fire. No one knows what it means anymore. The seller shrugs. Found it in a barn. But you stand there for a long moment, looking at the frayed thread in the half-finished image, and you think, someone once poured hours into this. Someone once believed this mattered. And now, hundreds of years later, it still does. You leave the market square behind, weaving through winding village lanes, where chickens peck lazily in the mud, and smoke curls from low chimneys like sleepy serpents. The sun is already slipping westward, casting a soft amber glow across stone walls and thatched roofs. There's a chill settling in again, not biting yet, but whispering of frost to come. You follow a narrow footpath that leads toward the chapel, its bell tower leaning ever so slightly, like a man who's listened to one too many confessions. The chapel is small, plain, and cool inside, with walls of rough-hewn stone and wooden benches smoothed by generations of weary elbows. But even here, especially here, the tapestry lives on. Behind the altar hangs a cloth, unlike the others you've seen. Darker, stiffer, more solemn. It's embroidered not with stories of knights or goats, but with saints, thorns and flames. A visual sermon for a congregation that couldn't read. You settle onto a creaky bench, your eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. The priest is old, his robes modest, his voice hoarse from a winter's worth of prayers. He speaks of humility and warmth, and, as your mind drifts gently, you realize he's also speaking of cloth. Of how even Mary, in every painting and every thread, is always wrapped in folds of blue. It's no coincidence. Colour had meaning. Blue for purity, red for martyrdom, gold for divinity. The church used these hues like punctuation, like warning signs, like stars to guide a darkened room. And for many, the only colour they ever saw, aside from the mud and mist of daily life, was right here, stitched into chapel cloths and altar hangings. Some peasants, you learn, would visit the chapel just to stare at the fabric, not for prayer necessarily, but for comfort, for beauty, for that brief illusion that the world wasn't only brown and grey and wet, that somewhere, somehow, someone had managed to pull a thread of heaven down into wool. The priest tells you a tale, half in jest, half in warning, of a time when a tapestry went missing. A small one meant to hang near the confessional, showing Saint Sebastian and a rather disturbing number of arrows. For weeks it was gone, presumed stolen, until one winter night a visitor arrived with frost-bitten hands and confessed to having taken it. Not to sell, not to burn, but to sleep under. I figured, the man said, that if the saint could survive arrows, he could probably help me get through a cold night. The tapestry was returned, a bit worse for wear, but somehow warmer than before. That's the quiet magic of these cloths. Even the sacred ones weren't just symbols, they were used. Not in the careless way we treat things today, but reverently, resourcefully. The same cloth that hung over the altar in spring might become a shroud in winter. A baptismal cover might become a banner at harvest. Nothing went to waste, not even holiness. In some chapels, villagers stitched their own offerings. Tiny embroidered symbols in the corners of larger tapestries. A sheaf of wheat, a pair of clasped hands, a fish. Tokens of gratitude, requests for blessings, prayers without words. Historians argue over whether these additions were sanctioned or sneaked in. One school of thought believes the clergy turned a blind eye, grateful for help with costly decorations. Another insists that only official church tapestries could hang, and any unapproved stitch was a kind of quiet rebellion. As always, well, you know what I'm going to say, historians still debate. You wander to the side chapel where a smaller tapestry hangs above a plain wooden table. This one is simpler, pale colours, looser stitches. It shows a tree with many roots and a dove perched just off centre. You ask what it means and the priest shrugs. It's always been there, he says. Before me, before most. That seems to be the theme around here. Things outlasting people. Threads that endure when memories fade. You wonder who stitched this tree, how long ago, and what they were thinking as the needle slipped in and out of the cloth, each pull a prayer or a question. There's something comforting in that thought, that hands you'll never know made this, for reasons you'll never fully understand. And yet, here it is, still here, still holding on. As the candles burn low and the chapel begins to empty, you linger a little longer. Outside, the cold is thickening. But in here, surrounded by wood and wool and candlelight, you feel something settle over you. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent, familiar, safe. And as you step back out into the fading light, you realize that tapestry isn't just an object. It's a gesture, a human attempt to soften the edges of the world, to make the divine feel tangible, to make the cold feel less alone. You pull your cloak tighter and walk back toward the village, the image of that tree still stitched in your mind. The sun has dipped beneath the hills now, leaving the sky awash in shades of ash and ink. You follow the footpath by lantern light, the faint glow bouncing off puddles and the glistening thatch of cottage roofs. The village is quieter than usual, chickens tucked in, fires smouldering, doors closed tight against the night air. But even in this hush, you hear the occasional murmur through thin walls, the creak of timber settling, and somewhere the high-pitched whistle of wind slipping beneath a roof tile like an uninvited guest. You find yourself drawn to one of the older homes. A squat, lopsided structure with smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. You're welcomed in by a young woman named Ida, whose small children scurry past your legs with nervous laughter. She offers you a seat near the hearth, little more than a shallow pit filled with smouldering peat and sticks. Still, it's warm enough to soften your fingers and thaw your cheeks. Her walls, like the others you've seen, are patched with tapestries. But these aren't for show. They're mismatched, uneven, and tacked up at odd angles, stitched together from old sacks, worn-out cloaks, even a few bits of what might have once been a tablecloth. One piece bears a faded emblem of some long-forgotten noble house. Another is crudely embroidered with what looks like a sheep, although its proportions suggest the artist was unfamiliar with the concept of legs. Ida notices your eyes tracing the stitches. That one was my mother's, she says, nodding toward the crooked sheep. She never liked to waste thread, so she used leftover bits from everything. An old belt, a broken sling, the cord from my cradle. You smile. It's more than a tapestry. It's a composite memory, a quilt of moments turned into insulation. That's how most peasant tapestries came to be, not from grand design, but from scarcity, from necessity, from whatever thread could be spared from mending, or whatever cloth could be scavenged before it turned to rags. Every tapestry told a story, but often it was a story told by accident. You reach out to touch one piece, your fingers grazing the uneven texture of burlap and wool. It's surprisingly soft, like the memory of something warm rather than the thing itself. Beneath your touch, you feel not just fabric, but years of lives stitched into the seams. And then Ida shares something odd. They say, she whispers, lowering her voice, that if you sleep beneath a tapestry with your name hidden in the thread, you'll dream of whoever made it. You raise an eyebrow, intrigued. Has that happened to you? She shrugs. Once, maybe, I dreamt of my grandmother sitting in the corner by the fire. She didn't speak, just smiled and kept stitching. Whether it's folklore or the result of sleeping near too much peat smoke, you don't question it. There's a magic to the idea. A quiet kind of magic, soft as wool and just as enduring. One of the children climbs into Ida's lap, clutching a frayed bit of cloth like a lifeline. It's not a toy. It's a strip from one of the wall hangings, no longer good for hanging, but too beloved to throw away. She calls it the warm piece, Ida says, brushing the child's hair. Says it helps her sleep. You glance back at the walls. They're covered with these warm pieces. Not just literal fabric, but emotional ones. Little patches of comfort in a world that offered precious few. Some of the patterns are geometric, rows of triangles, diamonds, stars. Others are more abstract, shapes that might be flowers or just the result of a shaky hand and poor lighting. But all of them share something in common: care. Even in the messiest stitches there's intent. A need to create something better than the bare, unforgiving stone behind it. Historians still debate whether peasants had any formal understanding of symbolism in their designs. Did 3 loops mean fertility? Did a 7-pointed star ensure a good harvest? Or was it simply, as one modern scholar wrote, what happens when your toddler helps you embroider? Either way, the meaning stuck, passed down not through books or lectures, but through repetition. A daughter copying her mother's favourite shape, a grandson inheriting a cloth with a pattern no one quite remembers, but everyone insists is lucky. Ida lifts the youngest child into bed, wrapping her in a tattered wool blanket, with embroidery so faded it's more suggestion than image. She sleeps better when that one's on top, she says, even if it smells like onions and chimney soot. You sit back, letting the fire's warmth soak through you, and as your eyes adjust to the dimness, you notice one more tapestry, almost hidden in the shadows behind the door. It's older, thicker, stitched with heavier thread in deep greens and browns. A forest scene, you think. Trees, maybe a river. And a figure, small, in the bottom corner, turned away, walking into the woods. What's that one? You ask. Ida glances over. Don't know, it came with the house. And somehow that makes it even better, because not every story needs to be explained. Some just are, like the wind in the chimney, the thread in the wall, or the quiet reassurance that someone, long ago, put a little softness between the cold and the people they loved. Morning breaks quietly without drama, no golden shafts of light, no birdsong fanfare. Just a gradual lifting of the dark, a change in shade more than in colour. You wake on a pile of straw softened by wool scraps, one side of your face pressed against a frayed bit of tapestry that smells faintly of wood smoke and thyme. Outside, boots squelch in the muddy lane, and somewhere nearby, someone is already splitting logs with rhythmic, patient thuds. You rise, stretch, and step back out into the village, now humming with life. The air has that early morning bite again, sharp, damp, and determined. You pass the chapel where the priest is hanging linens to dry. You nod to Ida's children as they chase each other with bits of stale bread. And then you head toward a cottage near the edge of the fields, drawn there by the sound of quiet conversation and the clack of wooden tools. Inside, 3 women sit close to the hearth, hunched over a wide wooden frame. It's a tapestry in progress, not hung but stretched taut like a drumhead, and filled with tiny stitches in soft ochres and faded blues. The women don't stop talking as you enter. They greet you with small nods and keep their needles moving. A choreography of habit and memory. One of them, a silver-haired woman with a smudge of ash on her cheek, glances up and gestures for you to sit. "We're finishing the marriage cloth," she says, "for Bridget. She'll be wed by month's end, poor girl." You ask what makes it a marriage cloth. "Well," the second woman says, "we don't all get dowries, but everyone gets stitches." You lean in to look closer. The design is modest, a small house, a pair of birds, and, running along the edge, a border of repeating circles. "Those are coins," the woman explains, "or wheels, or eggs. Take your pick, just something round. Round things are lucky." You chuckle. Medieval symbolism, a rich, muddled soup of piety, hope, and the occasional chicken reference. Bridget, it turns out, is marrying into a family from 2 villages over. She's 17, shy, and currently pretending not to be terrified. The tapestry will hang in her new home, part gift, part blessing, part insurance against whatever life might bring. "She'll have a cold room, that one," says the third woman, tightening the thread. "Stone walls, 1 window, all wind. This'll help some." And that's the heart of it, really. Tapestries weren't always made because someone had extra time or artistic talent. They were made because life was hard, because warmth was rare, because a young woman starting a new life in a strange home needed a little something from the old one. You listen as the women trade stories of births and blizzards, of livestock lost and found, of a storm so bad it blew the thatch clear off a neighbour's roof and left him chasing chickens through the snow in his nightshirt. All the while the needle moves. In, out, tug. In, out, tug. One of them tells a story about her own marriage cloth, long since faded, now used to wrap jars in the pantry. "Still smells like rosemary," she says, almost proudly. And then another story, a sad one, spoken softly, about a tapestry lost in a fire. "Nothing left," she says, "just smoke and nails." You sense the weight of it. In a world where nothing comes easy, every lost thread is a small grief. You ask if Bridget helped with the stitching. "A few parts," they reply. "That flower there, and the bird with the beak that's too long." The bird is indeed impressively beaky. But that's the thing, imperfections didn't ruin the piece. They made it. This wasn't a factory output. It was a patchwork of fingerprints, of trembling hands, of borrowed time between chores and caregiving. That beaky bird will make Bridget smile, even when the wind howls and the floor freezes. You look around the room and notice something else. Older tapestries, rolled and stacked near the wall. One is barely intact, its threads loose and darkened. You ask if it's going to be thrown out. The eldest woman shakes her head. "No, we cut pieces from the old ones to back the new. It gives them strength. That hits you harder than expected. There's poetry in that, layering the past beneath the present, weaving old love, old warmth, old hope into something new, something meant to last. And that's when one of them says, almost casually, the best parts are always hidden anyway. You think about that all the way back to the square, about the layers beneath every surface, about the things no one sees, the stitches behind the stitches, the faces behind the patterns, the hands behind the warmth. Even now, in this quiet world of peat fires and wool, the most important parts of life are rarely visible. They're felt, softly, silently, like the warmth of a wall hanging stitched with care by someone who loved you. By now the village feels familiar. You recognize the curve of the lane where the sheep tend to gather, the cracked cornerstone of the bakery wall, the way the wind always seems to blow hardest near the well. You walk slowly, letting the morning pass unmeasured, until your feet carry you toward the low-lying cottages near the fields. The poorer edge of town, if such a distinction can even be made in a place where everyone is already balancing on the edge of just enough. Here, the homes are simpler. Some barely qualify as structures at all. Wooden frames patched with mud and straw, roofs sagging under the weight of old snow. Inside one, you find a family gathered around a weak fire, a mother darning socks, a grandfather asleep with his back to the wall. And on that wall, hanging not quite straight, is a tapestry so worn it's nearly translucent. It catches your attention not because of its beauty. In fact, it's barely legible. Most of the colour is gone, and the pattern has frayed into vague shadows. But something about it holds you. You step closer, and only then do you notice what's left. The faint curve of a figure hunched over, and beneath it smaller figures curled up together. A woman and her children, perhaps. Or a saint comforting the poor. You ask about it, and the mother, without looking up from her needle, says, "That was my great-aunt's. She stitched it during the cold famine." The cold famine. You've heard mention of it before. A brutal winter when the crops failed, the river froze, and even the wolves stopped howling. Too thin to bother. People starved in their beds. Babies were born only to die 2 days later. Fires couldn't be kept going. And in the midst of it, this tapestry was made. She said, the woman adds, that if she couldn't feed her babies, she'd at least keep their memory warm. You swallow. The room feels heavier now. Not sad exactly, but full. As if every frayed thread in that tapestry still carried the heat of someone's desperate love. And that's something you've started to notice. That the most powerful tapestries aren't the grand ones in manor houses. They're the ones born from hardship, from hunger, from people stitching not out of leisure, but from the sheer stubbornness to leave something behind. In some cases, the needle became the only voice they had. There are stories, half-whispers passed down between hearths, of women stitching secret messages into tapestries during times of war. A misshapen flower to mark a betrayal. A wrong-coloured stitch to signal danger. A pattern that looked meaningless to most, but carried urgent truth to someone who knew what to look for. Historians still debate whether these were acts of resistance or romantic fiction. Some dismiss it entirely, just fanciful embroidery. Others point to surviving pieces with inexplicable anomalies and ask, why here, why now? No one agrees, but the possibility hangs there, like a thread waiting to be pulled. You watch the children in the cottage. One is playing with a piece of broken pottery, the other tracing a finger across the tapestry's faded edge. They don't ask about its meaning. They don't need to. It's simply part of the room, like the smoky air and the creaky floor. Comfort isn't always loud. Later, as you walk again through the fields behind the cottages, you stumble upon a small graveyard. Unmarked stones, most of them. A few bare crude symbols. A cross, a star, a crescent. One stone, flat and square, has a tiny scrap of cloth nailed into the earth beside it. The wind pulls at its edges, lifting it slightly, revealing stitched words, barely legible. She kept us warm. You pause. No dates, no name, just that. And really, what else is there to say? In a world where legacy is often reduced to lines in a book, or the memory of a name etched in marble, this quiet gesture feels deeper. A handful of words on thread, flapping in the wind. A story stitched so gently it could vanish in a storm, yet somehow still remains. You kneel and run your fingers over the cloth. It's damp, fragile, probably won't last another season. But someone made it, someone remembered. Back in the village, you find a small group mending another tapestry, patching holes, tightening loose threads. No one speaks. They just work, hands moving with the slow grace of people who know time is limited, but stories are not. The fire crackles. A pot simmers with something that smells more hopeful than edible. And on the wall behind them, the newest stitch joins the old. Not better, just newer. Another layer, another voice. And as the cold seeps back into your bones, you realize the tapestries never shouted. They endured. They warmed bodies, yes, but also memories. They were proof that someone lived here, loved here, froze here, and kept stitching anyway. Afternoon settles into a kind of quiet that feels less like silence and more like waiting. The village has gone still. Not asleep, not working, just pausing. You wander through the lanes with no destination, your boots heavy with mud, the chill now a familiar companion. A rooster crows late, confused. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and is never heard from again. Eventually, your path takes you to a cottage with an unusual exterior. Not because of its shape or size, but because of what's nailed to its walls. An enormous tapestry, exposed to the wind and rain, hung like a shield against the world. It's weather-worn, threads pulled loose, colours fading into a sort of dreamy haze. But even now it's beautiful. An elderly man greets you at the threshold, leaning heavily on a carved cane. Used to hang it inside, he says, seeing where your eyes have landed. Then the roof leaked, so up it went, better out here than mouldy and forgotten. He invites you in, and you duck through the low door into a room that smells of boiled cabbage, wet wool, and something faintly sweet, maybe apples or pipe smoke. On the walls inside, more tapestries hang. Not grand, not elaborate, but layered, one over another, as if the house is wearing a thick coat. You ask about the one outside, and the old man grins. That was my father's. He stitched it the year the frost killed all the wheat. Said if we couldn't eat, we could at least pretend we were noble. That particular year is still remembered in the region. A long, relentless winter, followed by a summer that never truly came. They called it the Long Grey. Crops failed, livestock died, people traded their boots for firewood. And yet somehow, in the middle of it all, his father stitched a tapestry of a feast. A real banquet, he says, chuckling softly. Roasted boar, pitchers of wine, servants everywhere, total fantasy. But we stared at it every night and imagined it was true. Sometimes I think that's what got us through. The tapestry, as it turns out, wasn't just for warmth. It was a form of resistance, defiance against hunger, a protest against despair. When you're cold and starving, it takes a strange sort of bravery to spend weeks embroidering a roast chicken. And this wasn't uncommon. Across Europe, during periods of famine and war, tapestries took on a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. In times when food was scarce, cloth would depict overflowing tables. During plagues, scenes of weddings and births. Not because these things were happening, but precisely because they weren't. Some historians argue this was a form of emotional survival. Others think it was an attempt to preserve memory, to say, this is who we were, this is who we'll be again. And predictably, a few think it was just denial with a needle. But the result is undeniable, a strange, bittersweet beauty in tapestries that told stories of abundance in the heart of scarcity. The old man gestures to one hanging near the hearth. That one's mine, he says. Started it during the last fever. It's a quiet scene. A family sitting together, no feast, no grand symbols, just people. A mother brushing her daughter's hair, a boy poking at a fire, a dog sleeping under a table. Ordinary moments captured not because they were rare, but because they were precious. I stitched it when we didn't know who'd survive, he says simply. Didn't want to forget the little things. You take a long moment just looking at the way the thread curves around the figures, the uneven stitches, the slightly lopsided fire. None of it is perfect, but all of it is real. Sometimes, he tells you, people would come and sit just to look at the tapestries, not to admire, but to remember. Not their own lives necessarily, but the idea of life, the normalcy of it, the promise that it existed once and maybe could again. You ask if he still stitches now. He shakes his head. Eyes aren't what they used to be, but I fix things, tighten threads, mend where I can. Before you leave, he gives you a scrap, a leftover piece of wool with no image, just a border of red and gold. For your own wall, he says, or your pocket. As you walk back through the village, the weight of that cloth in your palm is oddly reassuring. It's nothing really, just thread, just colour. But also, not just. Because now you understand. In a world where death came easily and warmth was fleeting, a tapestry wasn't just something you looked at. It was something you held on to. A small defiance, a quiet memory, a promise. And that promise, once stitched, stayed, even when everything else had gone. That night the wind changes. It doesn't howl like before. It presses, as though the sky has grown heavy and is leaning down, breathing slowly through every crack in every door. Fires are stoked higher, blankets are doubled. You find yourself huddled inside a cottage with a low ceiling and a fire that smokes more than it warms, your shoulders wrapped in an old wool shawl that smells faintly of juniper and thyme. Your host tonight is Thomas, a quiet man with thick hands and a soft voice. He doesn't say much at first, just gestures to the bench near the fire, and ladles you a bowl of thin stew. The walls of his home are lined with tapestries like the others. But here, there's something different. They're layered. Literally, one on top of another, folded, tacked, draped, stacked. Insulation, he says simply, and inheritance. You ask him to explain. He shrugs. My father's there, he says, pointing to one. And my mother, she's under it. You raise an eyebrow and he chuckles. Not her body, mind. Her tapestry. It's beneath his. She made hers first. So that's what it is. A vertical timeline. Generations stacked like pages in a book. Each new tapestry laid over the last. Not to erase, but to protect. They stitched until they couldn't, Thomas says. And then I stitched for them. You run your hand along the surface of the top layer. It's a hunting scene. 2 dogs, a rabbit, some trees. But beneath the hem, you glimpse a corner of something else. A wheel, maybe, or a sunburst. Just enough to hint at the story below. There's something touching, and a little haunting, about it. The idea that every wall might hold a dozen hidden stories, all stitched over, folded down, and quietly watching from behind the newer threads. Thomas shows you a folded stack under a bench. These are the ones we took down, he says. Too brittle to hang. But we keep them close. You never throw away thread that remembers. He unfolds one, carefully, gently, like lifting a fragile wing. The tapestry is thin, almost translucent in places. A harvest scene, perhaps. Rows of wheat, tiny figures bent in labour, a cart, a dog, a figure playing a pipe. No one remembers who made this one, Thomas says. Might have been my great-grandmother or hers. You ask why he doesn't hang it again. He smiles. Because it's been hung. It's tired now. It just wants to rest. You hadn't thought about that. Tapestries getting tired. But of course they do. The thread weakens. The weave loosens. The colours fade. And yet, the stories cling. Even in decay they hold on. There's a superstition in the village, Thomas shares it after a long pause, that every home must keep at least one hidden tapestry. Not for warmth, not for beauty, but to hold the memory of what the house has seen. If a home has no thread inside it, the wind forgets who lives there. And when the wind forgets, it gets mean. You want to laugh, gently, kindly. But something about the way he says it keeps you quiet. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. But tonight, with the wind crawling down the chimney and the fire throwing soft shadows, it feels entirely reasonable. Later, as you prepare to sleep on a pile of straw by the hearth, Thomas offers you a small folded cloth. Lay this under your head, he says. It's stitched with rosemary and foxglove. Dream stitch, we call it. The fabric is worn but soft, embroidered with a circular pattern that spirals inward. You don't ask what it means. You don't need to. You lay down, your cheek against the stitchwork, and close your eyes. That night your dreams come stitched in thread. You dream of figures bent over looms, of laughter rising over firelight, of storms pounding on rooftops while people wrap themselves in colours pulled from plants and patience. You dream of a young girl embroidering the name of her village into a corner of cloth and hiding it in a wall. You dream of a tapestry hung in the rain, not to protect the house, but to remind the sky that people still live here. And through it all, there's warmth. Not heat, but warmth. The kind that doesn't fade when the fire dies. When you wake, the fire is low and Thomas is gone. But the cloth is still beneath your head, and outside the wind is just wind again. No longer pressing, no longer mean. You fold the cloth carefully and place it in your satchel, a gift, a memory, a thread to carry with you. Because now you understand some tapestries aren't made for walls. Some are made for carrying, for remembering, for reminding yourself that even in the coldest nights, someone, somewhere once stitched something just to make the world feel softer. The next morning begins with snow. Not a blizzard, not a storm, just a soft, persistent fall of powder that seems to silence everything it touches. The thatched roofs wear white caps. Smoke rises more slowly. The trees look like they've paused mid-sentence, as if unsure what to say beneath this new blanket. You walk carefully along the village path, boots crunching faintly beneath you, and notice that every step you take seems to echo louder than it should. The whole world feels muffled as if wrapped in wool. You make your way toward the home of an older woman named Laura, who, by all accounts, knows more about the history of the village's tapestries than anyone still breathing. She lives alone in a crooked house at the edge of the woods, a house that looks, from the outside, like it might collapse if the wind were a little more opinionated. But when she opens the door and waves you in, the air inside is warm and dry, filled with the scent of lavender, smoke, and something sweet, dried apple maybe. And the first thing you notice, even before the fire, even before Laura herself, is the ceiling. Tapestries, dozens of them. They don't hang like paintings or lie flat like rugs. They're stitched together in long strips and pinned across the rafters, stretching like a canopy above your head. Layers upon layers, colour upon colour, like a forest of thread turned upside down. You stare for a long moment, stunned. It's like stepping into the underside of someone's memories. Laura laughs when she sees your face. Had to do something with them. The walls filled up decades ago. Figured the ceiling deserved its turn. You sit with her near the hearth, cradling a warm mug of whatever herbal miracle she's concocted this season, and she begins to tell you stories. Not of kings or battles, but of people. People whose names never made it into books. People who stitched because there was no other way to speak. She tells you of a woman named Elfrida who embroidered her dreams, literally. Every night she'd wake and stitch one image from whatever her mind had shown her. After 20 years, her tapestry was a surreal masterpiece of moons, geese ladders, wolves in bonnets, and once, memorably, a goose marrying a farmer. No one understood it, Laura says, but everyone felt it. You sip your tea and stare upward, your eyes tracing a scene of dancing figures stitched in copper thread. That one? Laura says, following your gaze. Stitched during the sickness, everyone was afraid to touch, but stitching, that was still safe. She explains that in times of plague, people turned to their tapestries like confessions. They stitched in isolation, passing needle and thread instead of hands and hugs. Some believed, she says, that the act of stitching could trap illness, tie it up in knots so it couldn't enter the lungs. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Didn't work, but it gave them something to do between funerals. There's one tapestry in particular she wants to show you. She pulls it from a chest, gently, reverently, like she's lifting a sacred book. It's smaller than most, maybe the size of a pillowcase, and stitched in thread that looks like spun dusk. Purples, greys, deep reds. The image is simple. A house surrounded by swirling lines. Wind, water, spirits. It was made by a widow, Laura says. No one remembers her name. Her house was the last on the lane. After her husband died, she stitched every day until she couldn't anymore. Then someone found this, folded on her bed, stitched into the last corner. I stayed warm anyway. She lets you hold it. The fabric is fragile, light as breath, yet heavy with meaning. You ask how many of the tapestries here are hers. Laura smiles. Some are mine, some were given, others just appeared. People leave them on my doorstep, folded in linen, like offerings. It makes sense. In a world where most things are taken, the tapestry is something you give, not for profit, not for glory, just because it's needed. You look around her cottage again. Every surface is softened by thread. Even the chair legs wear little stitched cozies. The stairs are padded in woven strips. Her cat, a round judgmental creature named Bramble, sleeps on a cushion that's clearly seen better decades. And then, with surprising seriousness, Laura says, "The stitch remembers what we forget." You wait. Touch enough thread, she continues, and it starts to feel like memory, not just yours, everyone's. You don't ask her what she means, you just let it settle in. Because here, beneath this sky of wool and thread and whispered stories, it makes sense. The memory isn't in the words, it's in the texture, in the time. In the fact that someone sat in dim light with cold fingers and tired eyes and kept going. That night, as snow thickens outside and firelight paints the room gold, you sleep beneath her tapestry ceiling, wrapped in a borrowed wool blanket and the softest hush you've ever known. And for a moment, maybe longer, the world is quiet, still, sewn together, held. By now you've stopped counting the days. Time in this village flows differently. Slower, gentler, stitched together like the layers of a well-loved tapestry. There's no rush here, no bells demanding answers, just a rhythm that hums softly beneath your feet. A rhythm that says, there's warmth in slowness. There's peace in doing one thing at a time. Today your feet lead you uphill, toward the edge of the forest. Snow still coats the ground in patches, softening the world's edges. As you walk, you pass a row of stone fence posts. One of them is wrapped, quite literally, in a strip of tapestry. Someone has tied it there, loosely, like a scarf for the land itself. At the crest of the hill sits a home, unlike the others. Round, low, almost like a hobbit hole, made of stone and sod. Inside you're greeted by two brothers, Arlen and Wolf, both weavers, both as different as sheep and wolves. Arlen is quiet, soft-spoken, with gentle hands and eyes that see more than they say. Wolf is broader, louder, always laughing at something, especially his own jokes. Together they run a weaving shed, not for the village's everyday needs, but for special cloth, story cloth, Wolf calls it. Most people don't want perfection, he explains, hanging dyed skeins near the fire to dry. They want memory, they want cloth that remembers where it came from. You spend the morning watching them work. Arlen spins thread so fine, it's hard to believe his fingers aren't machines. Wolf dyes with berries and ash and something he calls miracle moss. The smell is pungent, but it works. The colours are deep and earthy, burnt orange, smoky blue, faded green like the underside of lichen. No one else gets these tones, Wolf says proudly. The moss only grows under the north cliff, behind the fox den, smells like sin, stains like heaven. Their tapestries aren't meant for nobility or chapels. They're commissioned by villagers, for weddings, for births, for deaths, sometimes for none of those, sometimes just because someone needs to say something with thread. Like this one, Arlen says, showing you a half-finished panel. It's simple. A tree, a sun, a small curled fox beneath the branches. She asked for it after her dog died, he says. Didn't want words, just this. The tree is stitched with such softness you swear you can feel the wind rustling through it. The fox's ears twitch. Or maybe they don't. Maybe that's just what your brain wants to see. That's the thing about these tapestries. They breathe. Not literally, of course, but emotionally. They seem alive with something more than just thread. They show you another, a scene of the village during the last harvest. Children racing through rows of barley, a woman stirring something over a fire, a man lifting a basket to the sky like an offering. Everyone in the village added a piece, Wolf says. Even the old man who never speaks stitched the moon. You find the moon, crooked, a little too small, but unmistakably deliberate. There's something sacred about it, not because it's beautiful, but because it belongs. We keep a piece of every tapestry here, Arlen says, pointing to a chest in the corner. Just a corner, just enough. He opens it and lets you look. Inside are hundreds of scraps, all folded neatly. A leaf, a shoe, a bit of sky, a corner of text you can't quite read. Why keep just pieces? you ask. Arlen answers softly, because sometimes the whole is too heavy to carry, but a piece, that we can keep. Wolf laughs, and sometimes people just spill stew on the rest. Both are true. Both matter. You help for a little while, tying dyed yarns into bundles, sweeping errant straw from the floor. At some point, a woman arrives to collect her cloth, a tapestry made to mark her son's coming of age. She doesn't say much. Just runs her fingers along the edge, nods and presses a few coins into Arlen's hand. As she leaves, she turns to you and says, "It's not just thread, you know, it's time. Time you can touch. You'll remember that. Before you go, the brothers give you a small scrap, a leftover from a piece they made last spring. It's stitched with part of a wheel, the tip of a boot, and what might be a bird's tail. No use for it now," Wolf says, "but it'll remind you where you've been." And it does. You step back out into the snow-speckled world, the scrap warm in your pocket, the sound of the loom echoing faintly behind you. And as you descend the hill, passing the scarf-wrapped fence post once more, you begin to wonder, how many stories are stitched into this land? How many layers lie hidden beneath walls and behind rafters? How many lives are remembered, not in names, not in books, but in wool and dye and the steady rhythm of hands that refuse to stop moving? Maybe more than we'll ever know. The snow thaws by midday, though slowly, like the land is waking from a dream it doesn't want to leave. Thin rivulets of meltwater trickle along the village path. The thatched roofs glisten, and the trees shake off their frost like dogs emerging from a pond. You walk with care, each step squishing into soft, soaked earth, and find yourself drawn toward a cottage you've passed before, one you barely noticed at the time. It's smaller than most. The door sags on its hinges, one shutter hangs loose. And yet, the wall. The wall is different. Instead of a single large tapestry or scraps draped over cracks, this house has a mosaic of tiny squares. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of miniature stitched panels, each no larger than a dinner plate. They overlap slightly, edge to edge, like scales on a great woolen fish, or perhaps like the patchwork of a memory that refused to fade. You knock softly, and a young man answers, no older than 20, with ink-stained fingers and thread tucked behind one ear. His name is Henrique, and he's a tapestry mender, not a weaver, not a dyer. A mender. A profession you didn't know existed until now. He invites you inside, and the warmth hits you like a breath. The fire is modest, but every wall radiates a kind of quiet heat, not from flames, but from the dense layering of stitched cloth, thick and aged like bark. "I fix what others forget," Henrik says with a shrug. "That's the job." He gestures to a bundle on the table, a folded tapestry with a rip straight through the center. This one was in a granary loft. Mice made a mess. Someone used it to cover hay for a wedding feast and forgot to bring it back inside. Now it's full of smoke, soot, and goat hair. But it matters, so I'll fix it. You watch him work. It's not glamorous. He doesn't weave new panels. He doesn't stitch grand patterns. What he does is quieter, reinforce weak corners, reknot old thread, match fading dyes as best he can. It's like surgery for memory, slow, precise, and never quite perfect. Henrik explains that many of the tapestries in the village wouldn't have survived if not for menders. People think they're too worn to save, he says, but worn doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes it just means touched. That lands somewhere deep. You glance around the room. Every surface holds pieces in progress, some drying after careful cleaning, others mid-restoration. One is scorched around the edges, its once blue sky turned to smoky grey. Another is stained with something that might be wine or might be blood. No one seems to know, and no one wants to ask. "Do you ever add your own stitches?" you ask. Henrik nods. "Sometimes, tiny ones, hidden." You raise an eyebrow. He smiles. "It's a tradition. Menders sign their work, but never where it can be seen. I usually stitch a leaf, always just one." You look again at the wall, those hundreds of tiny panels. He tells you each one was salvaged, from abandoned homes, from burned-out barns, from cottages torn down when families moved or faded. Some came to me torn, others just found me. He points to one square that shows a single black shoe on a staircase. That one hung in a home where the mother died in childbirth. The father couldn't bear to keep the whole tapestry, but he saved this, just this one part. The weight of it presses against you, because this is the other side of the story. Not the weaving, not the telling, but the keeping. The part where what's left gets gathered, repaired, made whole again, not by undoing the damage, but by living with it. You spend hours with Henrik, speaking little, watching him mend a corner with a thread so fine it's barely visible. Watching him breathe slowly as he traces old seams with his fingers, like a blind reader feeling for meaning. Watching him pause to touch a thread, close his eyes and then continue, as though the cloth had spoken and he'd heard. Eventually he hands you a small square, one of his own. No story, no design. Just a soft spiral stitched in pale blue. "It's not much," he says, "but it lasts." You fold it carefully, slipping it into your coat. On your way out, you look back once more at the patchwork wall, that beautiful silent chorus of forgotten things, each square once cast off, each one carried back, each one given a place. And you realize something you hadn't before. Not all warmth comes from fire. Some warmth comes from memory, from effort, from choosing to keep what others leave behind. From thread that binds not just fabric, but people too. The next day dawns grey but not cold. A soft drizzle taps against the roof like fingertips, steady and insistent. The village is wrapped in that in-between weather. Not warm, not quite wet, not sure whether to wake or sleep in a little longer. You decide to follow the stone path that winds beyond the last cottages, where the landscape begins to roll gently toward the woods and the ruins beyond. Yes, ruins. You've heard whispers about them since your arrival. Not a castle, not quite. Just the broken bones of a long-abandoned manor or church or, depending on who you ask, an old outpost from some forgotten war. And there, among the ivy and the caved-in walls, you're told, is where some of the oldest tapestries were hidden. Or buried. Or both. You reach the edge of the ruins by midday. Moss clings to every surface. Ivy winds through fractured stone like veins beneath pale skin. Birds nest where chandeliers once hung. And there, near a broken archway, you see it. A thick roll of fabric, nestled in a wooden crate, that time itself seems to have forgotten. You kneel beside it, brushing away leaves and mud. The fabric is heavy, damp, but intact. You unroll a corner, slowly, reverently, revealing a section of tapestry so old the colours have become something else entirely. The reds are now rust, the blues like faded smoke. But the shapes remain. A woman with outstretched arms, standing between two animals, one a lion, the other perhaps a horse or a dog. There's no text, no dates, just image. You sit back on your heels and imagine the hands that made this. How long ago did they sit in this very spot, watching the thread slip through their fingers? Were they laughing, mourning, praying? You take the tapestry inside the ruins and lay it out carefully on the stone floor. And there, in the light that filters through a broken roof beam, you begin to see it clearly. This was not a tapestry meant to be decorative. It's rough, uneven. There are patches of thread so thick they bunch up like tiny knots of tension. Other areas are loose, almost lazy, like the weaver lost interest, or simply ran out of time. But there's meaning here. You can feel it. One section depicts a fire, with figures dancing around it, arms raised, mouths open in song or warning. Another shows a ladder stretching from a field into the sky, with birds flying both up and down. A third features a well, with something small and dark at the bottom. A coin? A ring? A secret? Historians often overlook these tapestries. The unofficial ones. The ones made not in noble houses or abbeys, but by villagers, wanderers, outcasts. The stories that don't fit into official records. The ones that survive in fabric but not in language. And yet, somehow, they're more honest, more human. You remember what Henrik said, sometimes the whole is too heavy to carry, but a piece, that we can keep. And maybe that's what this tapestry is, a piece of someone else's burden, stitched into wool so they didn't have to carry it alone. You fold the fabric carefully, taking care not to stress the old seams. There's a kind of reverence in it, not religious exactly, but close. A feeling that this cloth remembers more than you do, that it deserves your silence. Before you leave the ruins, you notice another bundle tucked beneath a stone shelf. It's smaller, wrapped in linen. Inside is a single square of cloth stitched with a black spiral, curling inward like a question that never ends. The same spiral you've seen before, on Henrik's patch, on Laura's ceiling. And you begin to wonder, is it a symbol, a signature, a thread connecting all of these seemingly separate stories? You carry both cloths with you back down the path, the weight of them not heavy in your hands, but in your heart. Because you now understand that these aren't just keepsakes, they're witnesses. They've seen what most people forget, what most people never notice, the quiet suffering, the quiet hope, the days when stitching a single line of thread was the most anyone could manage, and also the most that mattered. Back in the village, the drizzle has stopped. Smoke rises again from chimneys, doors creak open, life resumes. You take your cloths to the chapel, where the priest, without question or ceremony, finds a place for them. He lays the older one gently over a stone slab near the altar, smoothing its edges as though tucking in a child. The smaller spiral square he folds and places beneath a candle. They belong, he says simply. And you know he's right. Because by now you've seen enough to know that in this village, in this world stitched together by thread and time, nothing is ever truly lost. Not if it's remembered. Not if it's kept warm. Not if someone, somewhere, still believes in the power of a tapestry to hold what words cannot. The days begin to shorten more noticeably now. The twilight arrives earlier each evening, slipping in like a quiet guest who doesn't need to knock. You've grown accustomed to the rhythm, the cold that creeps in after sundown, the way candles are lit, not all at once, but one by one. As if the village is exhaling into the dark slowly, respectfully. You find yourself spending the evening with a woman named Miren, who lives above the bakery. A spot you've passed many times, always catching a whiff of something warm and yeasty, but never realizing that upstairs, another story waited behind a crooked blue door. Miren is older, her back slightly bent and her fingers knotted with age, but her eyes are sharp. She greets you with a nod, a fresh loaf wrapped in cloth, and an invitation to sit near the hearth, where a kettle hums quietly. And it's there, as she unwraps the bread and slices it with practiced grace, that you notice something different. The floor is covered in tapestries. Not rugs, not blankets. Tapestries. Soft, faded, stitched panels arranged in no particular pattern, covering every inch of the wood beneath your feet. Some are layered, some are patched. Some are so thin they seem to float above the floorboards like shadows of the past. You hesitate before stepping forward, unsure whether you're about to walk on memory or on art. Mirren chuckles. "Go on," she says. "They've already been walked on by time. You won't hurt them." She explains that long ago, when tapestries became too damaged to hang, people began laying them on the floors, not to discard them, but to elevate them in another way. They cushion the steps of the living, she says, and they remind us where we've already walked. One corner of the floor catches your eye. It's stitched with dozens of tiny boots and bare feet in various shades of brown and grey. That one, Mirren says, was made by a woman who lost 3 sons to the sea. She stitched their footprints from memory and laid it near her bed so she'd always hear them coming home. You sit with that image for a moment. Those feet that never walked back into her life, now forever softening the steps of others. Another patch shows a field of wheat bending in the wind. Another, a circle of geese around a campfire. One shows only clouds. Just clouds. And nothing else. Mirren lifts a panel from the floor near the fireplace. It's smaller than the others, square, with frayed edges and muted tones. "This one I made after the fire," she says quietly. "The old bakery before this one. It burned to the ground. Took half the lane with it. We didn't have much, but I stitched the smoke so I wouldn't forget what it looked like." You run your fingers gently over the threads. The smoke isn't grey or black. It's blue, curling up through a stitched sky in a single long winding line. You wouldn't have known it was fire unless she told you. It could be anything. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes people don't want the real image, she says. They want the feeling of it, a softened version, something they can bear to look at. That stays with you. The idea that memory doesn't have to be exact, it just has to be held. As the evening deepens, Mirren shows you a cabinet near the door where she keeps what she calls the walker's pieces. These are small squares of tapestry, no larger than a palm, given to travellers who pass through, offered with a bit of bread and a quiet blessing. Some of them carry the pieces with them for years, she says. Some sew them into their cloaks. Some lose them in rivers or leave them on graves. Doesn't matter. The thread still remembers. She lets you choose one. They're all different, stitched with suns, keys, leaves, tiny birds, spirals, stars. You pick a spiral, not unlike the one from Henrik, but stitched in warm gold on dull green. She smiles when she sees your choice. That one's meant to bring you home, she says. Home to what? You ask. Her smile widens, but she doesn't answer. She doesn't need to. You step carefully across the floor on your way out, each tread pressing into the lives and losses of strangers now bound together by thread. The wind outside has picked up, but inside you feel something still clinging to your coat. Warmth, yes. But more than that, story. You tuck the walker's piece into your pocket next to the others you've collected, each one stitched with its own silence, each one carrying the weight of someone else's hands. And as you walk back into the night, you begin to realize something. The world is full of tapestries you'll never see. Ones stitched into hearts, into glances, into goodbyes, into footsteps across floors like this one, worn down not by time, but by love. It's late now, the kind of late that makes the village feel like it's holding its breath. Fires have burned down to coals, doors are bolted, even the dogs, usually quick to bark at shadows, seem to understand that this is the hour for stillness. You walk slowly beneath a sky so heavy with stars it looks stitched together itself, constellations pinned into blackness by some invisible thread. You aren't sure where you're going, but your feet know. They take you toward the oldest part of the village, the hill where the first homes were built, where the stones underfoot are worn smooth by centuries of passage. And there at the crest you find what looks like a workshop, though it might once have been a home, or a shrine, or a library. Inside, a single candle flickers. An old woman sits beside it, stitching, alone. You ask if you can join her, and she nods without looking up. There's no fire, just that candle. And in its light you see what she's working on, a tapestry so pale, so thin, it's nearly invisible. The fabric is sheer, almost transparent, and the thread she uses is the colour of bone, delicate, fragile, beautiful. What is it? You whisper. A remembering, she says. You don't ask more. You just watch. She moves slowly, each stitch deliberate. Her hands tremble slightly but never miss. You notice that her needle is worn smooth, its point rounded from use, like a river stone. You imagine she's held that same needle for decades, maybe longer. Around her the walls are bare, not a single finished tapestry in sight. They don't stay here, she says quietly. When I finish them, I bury them. That surprises you. Bury? You ask. Why? She pauses, looks up. Her eyes are cloudy but clear enough. Because not every memory is meant to be seen, she says. Some are meant to be held, then let go. You let the silence stretch. It's not uncomfortable, just full. After a while she tells you stories, in that slow drifting way of people who have told the same stories many times, but still find something new in them each telling. She speaks of a woman who stitched her sorrow into a river scene and let it float away during spring melt. Of a man who embroidered his dreams into the hem of his daughter's wedding cloth, never telling her. Of a boy who couldn't speak, but who stitched so vividly that the village knew his every thought, and mourned him more deeply when he died. And all of those tapestries, she says, were buried, not lost, not discarded, returned. Cloth comes from earth, she says, wool, dye, flax, root. When the story's done, the thread goes home. It's a kind of wisdom that doesn't need explaining. You feel it settle into you like a warm blanket pulled up under your chin. You notice something else. A pile of folded scraps beside her. All blank, unused, waiting. They're not for me, she says. They're for others, for those who need to begin but don't know how. She picks one up and hands it to you. The cloth is simple, soft, plain. But when you hold it in your hands, it feels like something more, like potential, like silence waiting to be spoken. You sit with her a while longer, the candle burning lower. Outside the stars shift, the village sighs, and the air grows colder. And you begin to understand truly, deeply what these tapestries are. They're not just history, not just warmth, not even memory. They're grace. The grace of survival, the grace of choosing beauty over despair, the grace of hands that keep moving even when the world stands still. You leave just before dawn, carrying the folded cloth she gave you. Your own beginning. Or maybe your own remembering. You're not sure yet, but you know this. Some stories don't need to be told. Some are simply felt, carried, treasured, like a scrap of thread in a coat pocket, like warmth from a wall hanging your grandmother once stitched, like silence wrapped around your shoulders on a cold, star-filled night. Dawn arrives not with sunlight, but with silver. A soft, pearlescent mist clings to the village, quieting every sound, smoothing every corner. You walk through it as though drifting underwater, your breath rising in slow, visible waves. The world feels paused, not asleep exactly, but holding its hush like a secret it's not quite ready to share. Your steps bring you to the village square, now empty, the market stalls closed, the muddy path frozen in ripples. There's a kind of stillness here that feels intentional, like the village itself knows what day it is. You're met by Aldrich, the steward, a man with a lantern in one hand and a coil of twine in the other. He nods to you with quiet purpose. Today's the day we hang the memory cloths. You follow him as others begin to gather. Slowly, steadily, figures emerging from the fog carrying bundles in their arms. Each bundle is wrapped in linen, tied carefully. You recognize some of the faces: the weaver with the moss-dyed thread, the baker who stitches fire into floor cloths, the mother with the beaky bird, the child with the yellow onion-skinned square. No one speaks loudly, no one laughs. This isn't a sad day, but it's not joyous either. Something else, something older. The gathering takes place near the chapel wall, a tall dry stretch of stone reserved each year for a single purpose: the hanging of memory cloths. Not tapestries, not decorations. These are pieces meant only to be seen once. Aldrich explains, as he gently unrolls a panel, that each cloth is stitched with a story the weaver wants to share, just once. It may be a death, a birth, a storm, a secret. Some panels are covered in imagery, others are blank, save a single colour or shape. But all of them, by tradition, are hung before sunset and burned at nightfall. You blink. Burned? He nods. That's the way it's always been. Not everything is meant to last. And so they begin. One by one the villagers step forward. They hang their panels on the twine that now stretches from beam to tree across the chapel wall. Some require help. Others insist on doing it themselves. Each one takes a moment, a breath, before stepping back. You watch a boy hang a square stitched with a single dog's paw. A woman hangs a scene of mountains and falling snow. An older man, face unreadable, hangs a cloth showing nothing but storm clouds stitched in grey upon grey upon grey. There's no commentary, no questions. Just thread, and wind, and time. And then someone gestures to you. A woman you don't recognize. Eyes kind, hands weathered. Offers you a place along the rope. You hesitate. Then reach into your coat and remove the folded square from the night before. The one given to you in silence, meant for something you didn't yet understand. You hang it. The spiral glows faintly in the low light, gold on green. A circle with no center, no edge, a beginning or an ending, or neither. You step back and stand among them. All day the cloths ripple in the cold breeze. Villagers come and go, some linger, some just pass through, children point, elders bow their heads. And as the sun begins to lower, its light golden now, slanting through mist like fingers through silk. Someone lights the first torch. One by one the flames are passed. At nightfall the cloths are set alight. The fire rises quickly, bright, fierce, but not wild. It's a clean burn, the kind that carries something away without destroying it. The villagers watch in silence. No tears, no cheers. Just the quiet knowledge that the stories, once seen, have returned to the thread of the world. You watch your own spiral curl and darken, then vanish into smoke. And yet, you feel lighter, not emptier, just lighter. Someone once said that to remember something deeply is to let it go gently. Tonight you understand what that means. As the fire dies down to embers, the villagers drift home. No ceremony, no announcements, just soft goodbyes and the crunch of boots on frosted earth. You walk back through the square, the scent of smoke clinging to your coat, the memory of colour flickering behind your eyes. And when you reach your door, you find a gift waiting for you, folded neatly on the step. A square of cloth stitched with a single careful word. Stay. You wake to a stillness unlike any you've felt before. Not silence. The village is never fully silent. There's always the distant crackle of firewood, the low murmur of a kettle boiling, the muffled sound of someone shuffling across stone. But today it all feels softened, as if the whole world is wrapped in one great woolen cloth, and every sharp corner has been smoothed away. You lie for a while beneath your borrowed blanket, listening to the quiet rhythms of the morning. When you finally rise and step outside, the village meets you with that same gentleness. Doors are open, bread is baking, snow has melted just enough to reveal muddy paths like veins in the earth. And hanging from several windows, you notice something new. Scraps. Not full tapestries, just small patches. Triangles, fragments, some plain, some stitched with simple shapes. Stars, waves, spirals. Others bear only texture, colour, or memory. You pass Laura's home and see a patch of deep sky blue pinned to her sill. You recognise it, part of the ceiling tapestry you slept beneath. At Henrik's door, there's a swatch stitched with a single golden leaf. The baker has tied a frayed corner of the fire smoke panel to the handle of her oven. None of them are full stories, but none of them need to be. These fragments are not broken. They're pieces left on purpose, like breadcrumbs across the village, tiny reminders of what's been given, what's been carried, and what still lives in thread. You walk slowly, touching a few as you pass, feeling the different textures beneath your fingertips. Each one is warm in its own way, not from the sun, but from use, from hands, from time. And it strikes you in a way that feels both sudden and obvious, that tapestries were never really about the wall. They were about what we need close to us. Warmth, memory, prayer, laughter, grief, hope. The walls just happened to be where people put those things, and when the wall wasn't enough, they wore them, laid them on the floor, wrapped babies in them, draped them over coffins, buried them in fields, carried them in pockets. Because you don't need a castle to hang a tapestry, you just need a reason, a story you want remembered, or a sorrow you can't speak, or the simple act of surviving one more cold night. You reach the chapel again and step inside. The memory cloths are gone now, reduced to ash, but something remains in the air. A weight, a warmth, as though the walls have absorbed every thread and are now humming softly, like a blanket still holding the shape of the person it once covered. The priest is lighting a candle. He sees you, nods once and says only, "It's all still here." You believe him. Back outside, you make your way toward the edge of the village, where the path curves past the last cottages and disappears into the hills. There's no real reason to leave, but there's no pressure to stay either. That's the thing about places like this. They let you carry what you need and leave behind what you don't. And as you walk, you realize you've gathered quite a bit. A patch with a spiral, a scrap of storm stitching, a leaf in golden thread, a footprint, a dream, a silence, a song. None of them say much on their own, but together, They're everything. And when the wind picks up again, you don't flinch. You just keep walking. Your coat is heavy with thread and time, and behind you the village breathes quietly beneath a patchwork sky, stitched not with fabric but with all the lives it's ever touched, all the warmth it's ever offered, all the stories it chose not to forget. The air grows cooler as night returns. And so, softly, slowly, the story begins to dim. Like the firelight in a cottage window, gently fading behind drawn curtains. Like the last stitch pulled through wool with a sigh. Like the hush of a blanket tucked up to your chin. Shh. It's warm now. You can rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.